Welcome, everyone. As you join today's webinar, we invite you to use the chat function on Zoom to introduce yourself to the panelists and the other attendees of today's webinar. You can drop in your name and your location, your congregation or organization if you're affiliated with one, and we can build some community here today. So we invite you to do that. And we have lots of people joining today, so we'll just take a couple of minutes as everyone is joining to get ourselves ready for today's webinar. So again, if you're just getting on, we want to welcome you and invite you to drop into the chat your name, your location, and your congregation or organizational affiliation if you have one, so we can get to know each other a little bit today as we prepare for today's webinar with Catherine Hayjo, Climate Change, Our Faith Values, and 2020, a conversation between myself, Reverend Susan Hendershot, and Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. So welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here with us today. Looks like we've got really great attendance. Thanks to everyone who is dropping their information into the chat. It's fun to see that going by very quickly. Good luck reading all of it. And again, you can introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your location, and your congregation or organization if you have one. And we'll just wait another moment as we have so many people joining this webinar today. I'm Reverend Susan Hendershot. I'm president of Interfaith Power Light, and our mission is to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. We were founded in the year 2000 as a religious response to global warming, and I want to welcome you to today's conversation with Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, Climate Change, Our Faith Values, and 2020. And I'll be joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. And our topic today is really about how to communicate with your family and friends about the climate crisis from a position of shared values. So first, we'll talk a bit with Dr. Hayhoe about her work and the perspective that she brings as a person of faith. Then we'll offer some resources for voter education to ensure that all of you attending feel prepared to educate your own communities about climate and this election. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session and an opportunity for you to ask questions of Dr. Hayhoe, and you probably have a lot. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can today. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A feature. If you're not familiar with where that is on Zoom, if you look on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see Q&A. So if you'll use that feature, we can keep track of the questions there, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of our discussion today. And before we begin, I want to thank our partners, Catholic Climate Covenant and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, for being with us today. And so I want to introduce Jose Aguto of Catholic Climate Covenant to introduce himself and the Catholic Climate Covenant. So take it away, Jose.
Thank you, Susan. Blessed to be with you all here today and delighted to be in partnership with IPL and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We, the Covenant, are also engaged in what we would call moral discernment with regard to how Catholics may want to make their voter choices this election season. This particular webinar is the second of our 5-part series where we're helping Catholics discern through the lens of their faith and our fundamental values. We also have with the Covenant a voter pledge, which is centered around their discernment. And we invite anyone who's interested to take that pledge. And I'll just read it out just briefly. based on Pope Francis's Laudato Si, love for society and commitment to the common good, are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. So during these challenging times, according to the pledge, we are called to bring our faith and our consistent moral framework to the important work in our communities, nation, and world. Just as St. Francis of Assisi demonstrated throughout his life, we must put our love into action. So the specific pledge is, I pledge to vote with love and action in mind so as to protect life, respect human dignity, and promote the common good, including God's gift of creation. So feel free to go there, and also welcome any comments or questions you may have of me to help with your discernment. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks so much for being here today. And I also want to introduce Kyle Meyer-Skop of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action to talk about the work that they're doing this election season.
Thank you, Susan. Also delighted to be in partnership today with Interfaith Power Light and with the Catholic Climate Covenant. Great to see my friend and YECA's senior advisor, Dr. Katharine Hayjo. Always a delight to be able to hear from Catherine. Young Evangelicals for Climate Action is a national organization of young Christians across the country who are coming together and taking action to address the climate crisis as part of our Christian witness and discipleship. We often say we don't do this because we're left or right. We don't even do this because we're environmentalists. We do this because we're Christians. And this is just what it looks like to follow Jesus in a warming world. Since 2012, we have mobilized more than 20,000 young Christians across the country toward climate action. And this fall is no different. We also have our own voter engagement programs and campaigns up and running. I believe there may be another word about that later, at least a link to some of our efforts. So in the interest of time, and because you're here to hear Catherine and not me, I'll save that, but I will drop a link to our website in the chat box so that if you are interested in learning more about Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, you can head to that website. And like I said, there will be another link to some of our voter engagement campaign work later in the webinar.
Thank you, Kyle, and thanks to both of our partner organizations for being with us today. We really appreciate that. And with that, we are grateful to have Dr. Catherine Hayhoe join us for this timely discussion today. And so I want to introduce her to you. First of all, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and the places where we live. She is an endowed professor at Texas Tech University. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and she has been named one of Time's 100 Most Influential People, the United Nations Champion of the Environment, and the World Evangelical Alliance's Climate Ambassador. And if you want to learn more about Catherine and see her resources on climate science and communicating about climate science, we're dropping a link for you into the chat so you can go to her website and find out more and watch some of her wonderful TED Talks. So Catherine, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is great to be here with all of you.
Well, we have an impressive turnout today on this webinar. People are very excited to hear from you. And so I want to dive into our conversation today because I think, of course, we are in the midst of some really challenging times right now. We have seen an increase in 2020 in climate disasters from these just massive wildfires that are happening in the Western US, to this derecho that went through Iowa, to hurricanes in the Gulf and the Southeast. And I think that one question that may be on everyone's mind right now is, are we now able to directly attribute these weather events to climate change?
Well, often people say, was this event climate change or not? as if it was either 100% climate change or 0% climate change. And the answer is always in the middle, because climate change is a threat multiplier. That term actually comes from the US military. And what that means is that most times climate change is not creating something that wouldn't otherwise exist. We have always had heat waves and hurricanes and wildfires and floods and other disasters as long as this planet's been here. But what climate change is doing is it's making them worse. And we can actually put numbers on that now. That's what climate scientists are doing these days. So for example, we know that without climate change, we would see over 10 million acres burned across the whole Western US since the 1980s, just naturally. But with a changing climate, we've seen almost 25 million acres burned as of 2015. And of course, those numbers are climbing every year. Wildfire after wildfire is breaking the record for the most area burned. And that's how climate change is affecting wildfires. Most wildfires in the lower 48 states are human ignition, but once those fires start, they have all of this dry tinder thanks to climate change that enables them to burn out of control, breaking record after record. With hurricanes, for example, with Hurricane Harvey, we know that about 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if the exact same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. We know that climate change has made heat waves much more likely. The European heat wave of last summer was 5 times more likely due to climate change. The Siberian heat wave from this summer was virtually impossible to happen without climate change. It was over 100 degrees. So yes, climate change is affecting our extremes, and we can put some numbers on those today.
That's really good to know that we can put some numbers with it now, because it feels maybe a little more tangible for people when we have some ability to, you know, have the science sort of back up what our gut instincts are telling us right now. Yes. And I think, you know, that our audience would be interested, Catherine, in learning how you came to be a climate scientist. What first interested you in the study of climate?
Absolutely. Before I do that, though, I'm actually going to drop a link in the chat. And the link is to one of our Global Weirding episodes that specifically explains how climate is changing and how it's affecting our extremes. Now, I heard a comment saying we're freezing. Are we freezing? I can see you just fine. Can you see me okay?
I can see you fine, yes.
Okay, so if your screen is freezing and you're listening, it's probably because of your internet. I think we all look fine here. But this is being recorded and you will be able to watch it later, and the recording is not freezing, so we're all good.
Exactly.
Okay, so I was actually studying astrophysics. I was planning to be an astrophysicist, and I had almost finished my undergraduate degree. I was already doing research looking at galaxy clustering around quasars, and I was planning my next move to graduate school, but I needed 1 extra credit to finish my degree. So I looked around, and there was a brand new class on climate science over in the geography department at my university, and I thought, well, why not take it? It looks interesting. So I am Canadian, so I grew up with the idea that the sky is blue and the grass is green and climate is changing due to human activities. But I had mentally lumped this issue together with what I considered environmental issues that environmentalists care about, that the rest of us wish them well. So I felt like there were certain people that cared about those things, and I wasn't one of those people. I wished them well, but that wasn't really what I did. So I took this class, and I was absolutely astonished to learn that climate change is, of course, an environmental issue, but it really is an everything issue. Climate change affects our health. It affects our food and our water. It affects our security. It affects the safety of our homes. It affects the economy. But most importantly, it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And for me as a Christian, that's where it really hit me, because I believe not only do we have responsibility for every living thing on this planet, which of course includes our fellow humans, but I particularly believe that we are to care for those less fortunate than us. And that's not a uniquely Christian belief. You see the same traditions in Judaism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, and in Islam. The idea that those of us who have been blessed are to care for those who have not been. And with climate change, not only are we failing to care for the poor and the vulnerable, but we're actually making their lives worse. Because climate change is a threat multiplier. And although it multiplies our wildfires and our hurricanes here in North America, abroad, it multiplies things that devastate people's homes, their livelihoods, their food, that lead to refugee crises and famines, devastation and death. And so that for me was a huge inflection point in my career. I thought to myself, how can I not study this huge global problem? Because it absolutely is not fair.
I think that's just such a beautiful statement of how your faith is so connected to your work, which for some of us here in the US, that seems to be a bit of a struggle when we think about our faith and science and maybe ways that they actually are in opposition to one another. And I'm curious, because of you mentioned that you're Canadian, and so your perspective coming into this is a little different than some of us here in the US as well. But I'm just curious to know whether there have been times that studying climate change has challenged your faith in any ways.
So I grew up with a dad who's a science teacher. And I learned, first of all, that science is the coolest and most fascinating thing that you could possibly study. I was indoctrinated in that from a very early age. But I also learned from him that if we believe that God created this universe that we live in, then what is science other than trying to figure out how God did it? So there should not be a conflict between science and faith if we believe in a creator God. So why is there this conflict? It's one that's been deliberately and artificially manufactured over the years to shore up political positions and authority. And that begins with Galileo and the church. The church didn't want to say that the earth was not the center of the universe because that would somehow challenge the Pope's authority. It continues with issues of origins and evolution. The debate over evolution took root in the United States, and it was promoted by politicians. Specifically, the Secretary of State was the one who took part in the Scopes debate, because specifically they wanted to combat what they saw as ideology coming from Europe. And with climate change, the only reason there's any intersection between faith is not because of any theology that we have or might not have, but it's because climate change shows that we need solutions, and those solutions will alter the balance of power and wealth in this world, because the richest corporations in the world are the ones who are producing all of the fossil fuels that we're burning that's causing climate change. So this conflict between science and faith has always been actually between science and power. And so that's why the more I study this world and this universe, I don't see any conflict between my faith and my science. But what does discourage me is this. What discourages me is when I see people who claim to believe that we have responsibility to care for this planet, who claim to believe that we are to love others as we have been loved, and that the greatest commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves, yet their behavior says exactly the opposite. That to me is the most discouraging thing, to be constantly hearing from people, as we all are in this world, who say one thing yet walk a completely different way.
So I'm curious, when you do hear those things, you speak to a lot of groups all over the country and around the world. And I'm curious to know how you respond to this misperception that people have about the conflict between faith and science. How do you use that as sort of a teachable moment for people in a way that, doesn't further entrench them in their position, let's say?
That's a good question. And I actually have a talk that I've given specifically on this, looking at the conflict model of science and faith, and then looking at the independent magisteria concept, where you do yours and they do theirs, and never the twain shall meet. And then the complementarian version of science and faith, which is the one that I specifically agree with, which is that they complement each other. In other words, for example, in the area of climate science can tell us that climate is changing, that humans are responsible, that the impacts are serious, and we need to do something. But what are we supposed to do? Science can't tell us what we're supposed to do. That's where our values come in. And our values don't necessarily come from our faith. People who are humanists and atheists have plenty of values related to fairness and justice and equality and taking care of people who are less fortunate than us and caring for our common home, as the Pope calls it. But for those of us who do belong to a faith tradition, that's where our values come from. And our values are not something to be shunted to the side. They are front and center when we're making decisions. So when I talk to people about this, what I do is I start with what we believe. And I speak specifically often to people who share my beliefs. I encourage other people who have different beliefs to speak to people who share their beliefs too, because we're most effective messengers if we speak to the people that we have most in common with. But I start with what we actually believe. So, speaking from the Bible in Genesis 1, how it talks about how we have responsibility over every living thing on this planet, how we are to, the Hebrew words are abad and shamar, how we are to care for, protect, keep this planet. And then going on to talk about how we are to care for others who are less fortunate than us. There is no conflict when you actually go to what the Bible says. It's when we listen to politicians, pundits, and so-called religious leaders whose statement of faith is written first by their politics and only a very distant second by the Bible. That's where the conflict arises.
I wonder if you could share with our audience today maybe a specific example of a time when you entered into conversation with someone, maybe at an event or something like that, who was genuinely open but questioning about how to bridge the divide between how they are thinking about climate change and their faith.
Sure. Well, I have conversations with people all the time. And what's really important to recognize is that we aren't just black or white, yes or no, believer or denier on this issue. We fall across a spectrum. And the 6 Americas of global warming really explains what the spectrum looks like. So at one end, we have people on climate change who are alarmed. And then we have people who are concerned and cautious. And then we have people who are doubtful or disengaged. And then finally, we have people who are dismissive. So just a second here, because I'm looking a bit fuzzy. That's a little bit better. So people who are dismissive are the people who talk about this all the time. And if somebody is really obsessed with rejecting climate change and they just can't stop talking about it, we're not going to be able to change their mind because they're not even going to listen to anything that we say. But what we can do is we can talk to people who have genuine questions. And how we can tell that they do is if they're willing to engage in a two-way dialogue. So if you feel like somebody's listening to you and it's a two-way street, so you have to listen to them first, that's when we can have those positive conversations. So I've had many of these conversations, and let me just give you one example. So a couple of years ago, we had some visitors at our church. My husband's the pastor of the church. They wanted to go out for lunch afterwards, so we all went out for lunch. And over the course of lunch, it came up that the pastor's wife was a climate scientist. You could tell they were very surprised. So the man leaned across the table and he said, "Do you believe in climate change?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "But aren't you a climate scientist?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, why don't you believe in it?" And I said, "Because it's not a religion. I believe in God. I don't believe in climate change. I believe that God gave us a brain and a sound mind to actually look at his creation and figure out what's happening. And so I know that climate is changing. I know that humans are responsible because we've checked every other reason that it could be. And I know that the impacts are serious, and I care about it because of my faith. Because we are to care for every living thing, including our sisters and brothers on this planet. And so because I immediately reframe the discussion as it's not a competition between the false religion of climate change and the true religion of whatever somebody believes, rather it's a case of whoever we are, we already care about climate change, we just didn't realize it. So that conversation went in a completely different direction because he was expecting me to be the false prophet of the green religion, whereas in fact, climate change is not a religion. It is just a fact that no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, no matter where we live, it matters to every single one of us.
That's so great. And I think about how meeting people where they are is so important in this work. And even the work that we do at Interfaith Power and Light, where we are working with faith leaders all over the country, people who are in leadership in their congregations in various roles. And we know that congregations have been doing important work on issues that intersect with climate change for such a long time, whether that's hunger or, immigration and refugee resettlement to disaster relief, so many intersected issues. And sometimes it's maybe a little bit about helping them to connect the dots between the thing that they already care about and the issue of climate change, and then seeing what they can actually do to address the problem. And I love your centering this on the conversation about values. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you think this values-based conversation can really move people maybe a little bit out of the head conversation and a little more into the heart conversation.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the key, because every conversation we have on climate change these days seems to be from the head, arguing over facts and information and data, when we know we live in a post-truth society where my opinion is better than your facts, if my opinion agrees with that of my group or my tribe. So we've seen this as recently as, just today on Twitter, where all kinds of people have this map of wildfires. And all the wildfires are in the United States, but there's no wildfires on this map in Canada. So everybody's like, oh, isn't it a coincidence that all of these so-called climate impacts stop at the border? And of course, the reality is that it's a US map, so it doesn't show Canadian data. And if you go to Canada, it's got all the Canadian data plus some US data too. So arguing over these facts, though, doesn't change anybody's mind. The only reason why I combat disinformation on Twitter, for example, is for the people who actually are not sure about it, not the people who are posting it. How do we build a bridge, though, between this contentious divide that's getting bigger and bigger? Climate change, for a number of years, has been the most politicized issue in the entire United States for years. And it's rapidly moving in that direction in Canada, Australia, the UK, and beyond. I was talking with a colleague from France this morning, and he was telling me about climate denial in the Christian church in France as well. Even as of just a few weeks ago, climate change is still the most politically polarized issue, although coronavirus is now number 2 and racism is number 3. So how do we have a conversation about climate change if it's even more contentious than racism and coronavirus? It begins with the heart, not the head. It begins by connecting over genuinely shared values. And if we don't know what those are, we need to have a conversation to figure out if we have any. And then once we figure out what some shared values might be, and they can sometimes be as simple as knitting or cooking or the place where we live or our kids, a shared faith, obviously, or both being members of the Rotary Club or having previous military experience or enjoying birding or hiking or the same types of hobbies. Once we can figure out what we have in common, step number 1. Step number 2 is connect the dots between climate change and what we already care about. So instead of trying to instill new values into people, which is frankly impossible at any age past, that of a young child, instead of trying to instill new values, which also carries with it the overtone of judgment. If I'm trying to instill new values into you, that means I find your values to be subpar, which never comes across well. Instead, respect and acknowledge someone's values, connect the dots to climate change, to show how they're the perfect person to care about climate change, exactly who they are. In fact, caring about climate change makes them a more genuine expression of who they already are. And then, step number 3, offer positive, constructive solutions that are consistent and compatible with their values and their ideology. Because the 2 biggest problems we have are this: not the science. I know all the arguments start with the science, but that's not the biggest problem. The 2 biggest problems we have are, number 1, we don't think it matters to us. And number 2, we don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. So bond over shared values, connect the dots to how climate change affects them, and then talk about a positive, constructive conversation that we can engage in. And that is how we can build that bridge. And if you want more, I'm going to drop a link to my TED Talk in right here. Or Tiffany, if you have that, you might go ahead and do it yourself, because I go through a little bit more, how do we do this? And I give some examples.
That's really helpful, Catherine. And of course, you know, this 2020 is a big year in the country, right? Not only because of all the strange things that are happening and all of the climate wildfires and global weirding, as you say, that's happening this year, but also because it's a major election year. And I wonder if you can say why you think 2020 is so important for climate action, considering that it is an election year, and also being mindful that we're a C3 organization.
Yes. Absolutely. And for anybody who missed my answer to the previous question, I posted my TED Talk here. You can click on the TED Talk and it goes through that bond, connect, and inspire with positive solutions framework. So people often ask me, is it too late? And the answer to that is yes and no. So just like with climate impacts, people always want to know, is it all climate change or nothing climate change? And with is it too late, they want to know, is it, you know, not too late at all or 100% too late? And the answer is in the middle. It's as if we've been smoking for years and even decades. So there is some lung damage. Some impacts of climate change are already here today. Some are inevitable because of our past choices. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So when is the time to stop? The time is now, as soon as possible. And I know, because this is what I study, I know that the faster we reduce our carbon emissions, the better off we'll be. There isn't any magic number. 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees don't mean that if we end up at 1.499 or 1.999 instead of 1.5 or 2, it doesn't mean that everything's okay. Those are just goals that we have set because we need goals. If you're going to lose weight, what's the first thing you do? You step on the scales and then you set a goal, right? But the goal isn't a magic goal. It just means that it's something to head towards. What we do know from the science is that the more we cut our carbon emissions, the less change there will be and the better off we will all be. 2.5 degrees is better than 3. 2 degrees is better than 2.5. 1.5 is better than 2. But no matter what we do, our actions and our choices really do make a difference. And as soon as possible is that time. So today, unfortunately, we have people in power, and this is not just a US issue, this is happening around the world, people in power who are saying that a thermometer isn't telling us that it's getting warmer, who are saying that we don't know it's humans when in fact we've known since the 1850s that digging up coal at that time, and then later oil and gas, is wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to run a fever. A thermometer is not liberal or conservative. What we need is we need political parties of all stripes to say, okay, the science is real, but we can disagree over solutions because there's liberal solutions and there's conservative solutions and there's bipartisan solutions. And the science can't say this is the best solution. The science just says we need to cut carbon. So we need politicians across the entire political spectrum to have solutions. And that's why I'm so encouraged by conservative organizations and conservative people that are proposing tangible solutions to climate change. We need to hear from everybody because this problem affects every single one of us, no matter where we live, no matter what language we speak, no matter what country we're in, and no matter how we vote.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's really wonderful to think about how you know, hope sort of requires that we have a sense of agency. And I think that's really what you're saying is we do still have a sense of agency and that our choices matter. And I'm gonna pause at this point because I want to invite Kyle back into this conversation so that he can ask a question from Young Evangelicals for Climate Action.
Sure.
Thanks, Susan. Catherine, you've always been a great champion of YECA and of the leadership of young people across the board, especially young Christians, on this issue. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you think the unique value add or the unique role that young people of faith bring to the climate action space, and why is it so important for young people of faith to be engaged?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that. And let me just say that if you're not familiar with Kyle's organization, it is such a source of inspiration and encouragement. Tens of thousands. What are your numbers at now, Kyle?
Over 20,000.
Over 20,000 young evangelicals across the United States alone advocating for climate policy and clean energy policy at every level, from their city to their state to the national level. Young people's voices are really important because the most important thing we can do, and this is the topic of my TED Talk, the most important thing any of us can do is talk about this. So often we're told to change a light bulb or drive an electric car, get solar panels, eat less meat, fly less or not at all. And yes, all of those things absolutely do reduce our personal carbon footprint. Do not get me wrong. But 2/3 of the heat trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era have been produced by 90 corporations. And on the list of the richest companies in the world are many of those companies. So the reality is we need system-wide change. And to get that change, we need to talk about climate change. We need to use our voice to advocate for change, and we need to vote. And kids have shown us that in spades. Let me just give you one example. So a few years ago, there was a young girl, early teens, who was very worried, very anxious, and very depressed about climate change. She reduced her carbon footprint. She persuaded her family to do it too. They did everything they could to live a low carbon lifestyle. And if that was the only thing they had done, nobody would know her name. But she did one more thing. She took a piece of white cardboard. She painted a few simple words on that cardboard, "School strike for climate." She went and she sat outside a building, and now she is the poster child for young people advocating for climate action around the world, because of course her name is Greta. Why do we know her name? It's because she used her voice. Every young person has a voice to use, and they are so creative, they are so dedicated, they are so persistent, and they are so passionate in using those voices that I think that they not only encourage us all, they challenge us all as well.
That's fabulous. Thank you. And we're gonna move on in a moment to some questions from our attendees. It looks like we have a lot of questions, so we'll get to a few of them. But first, I want to just share a few ways that you can help. And the first, in whatever way is appropriate for your faith tradition, you can pray. Pray that we will hear the cry of the earth and the cries of our neighbors to act on climate. And yet we also pray with our actions. So as Catherine says, we encourage you to have courageous conversations with your family and friends. Educate yourself and others. You can see that Catherine has a number of TED Talks. They're fabulous. I encourage you to go in and watch those, and others of many scientists who are using their voices and sharing information with us. And we also want to encourage you to get involved with our Faith Climate Justice Voter campaign. So we have a website with lots of materials. We're dropping that link into the chat for you. And of course, if Catholic Climate Covenant or Young Evangelicals for Climate Action brought you here, we're dropping the links to their voter campaign efforts into the chat as well. So we encourage you to check out their resources also. Additionally, IPL and Faith and Public Life have a faith voter reflection guide for 2020. And this is a guide that can help you understand how faith voters align their values with their vote. And the guide is available digitally and also in a print version. So that is also in the chat for you. And then if you're a faith leader, if you preach and teach regularly in your congregation, we encourage you to use your prophetic voice to encourage your congregation to vote. So we have some resources for you and some sermon resources that can assist you, and those are also going into the chat. And then finally, we really want you to pledge to vote your values this year. So you can take the Faith Climate Justice Voter Pledge and also share that pledge with your community. So we encourage you to do that. Finally, please make sure your voter registration is current and make a plan to vote. With the pandemic and other voter suppression tactics, elections this year might be challenging in places. So make a plan to vote early. Our partner, When We All Vote, offers Voter Resources Hub, where you can check your voter registration, request your mail-in ballot, research your ballot, find your polling location, register to vote, and more. And so we're dropping the When We All Vote's Voter Resources Hub into the chat for you as well. And so at this time, I'm gonna ask Tiffany if she wants to start us off with a question from someone in our audience today.
Yes, there are 77 questions in the Q&A and a lot in the chat, so we're obviously not going to get to all of them, but maybe I've tried to sort of put them into categories. I think maybe an easy one to start off with is there was several folks asking about, Catherine, your comment around the number of acres of wilderness burning now versus if we didn't have climate change, and questions about a resource for that people can cite. Oh, and you're on mute.
I've been dropping things into the chat as we've been going along because I've been seeing questions about what do we say to people who are pro-life? How do we address the issue of overpopulation? How do you know which companies are responsible for most of the global greenhouse gas emissions? I've been dropping those resources into the chat. So I will go ahead and drop one more resource into the chat, which is to the National Climate Assessment. Now, if you're not familiar with the National Climate Assessment, it is massive. I am one of the hundreds of authors that wrote the nearly 2,000 pages, but don't worry, it's not a mystery novel. You don't have to start at the beginning and go to the end. It's very well organized, and it has a section for each part of the United States. And we have a global weirding episode also, a video for each section of the United States. And then it has a section for each sector, including indigenous peoples, including coastal areas, and including rural areas, which are often really left behind when we're talking about climate impacts. And in the Southwest chapter, that's where you find the statistics on area burned by wildfire that I quoted. So I put that in the chat, and I encourage everybody to check out the National Climate Assessment because it's a great resource. And they also have chapter summaries in Spanish too, which are fantastic to share.
Thank you. That's great. And we'll be, along with recording this this discussion, we'll send that out to everybody who's registered, along with all the links in the chat in an email tomorrow morning. So we'll get that link to you if you don't catch it in the chat. Lots of other questions. Some question maybe about category about sort of the climate impacts right now. So somebody referenced the NPR story yesterday talking about people in the Northwest asking about where do we go now in these times. And so the question is, how soon do you think other states will be asking this question?
People have been asking me that question already for over a decade, because what we see again is climate change is a threat multiplier. So it is usually not creating issues we haven't had before. The West has had wildfires and air quality issues. The Gulf Coast has had hurricanes. The Midwest has had floods and droughts, but it's making them worse, a lot worse, to the point where it affects the safety of our homes and our families. It affects the local economy. It affects the quality of the air that we breathe and the water we drink and our health. And so people are starting to ask, where should we go? Now, they've looked at it, and so far we're not actually seeing climate migration happening in large amounts, but we are starting to see climate refugees, and it's happening right here in the US. Native Americans are on the front lines of this, from tribes in Louisiana whose land is sinking into the Gulf of Mexico, to tribes up in Alaska whose land is literally crumbling under their feet. They are already searching for other places to live because their former land is literally uninhabitable. But soon more of us will start to find ourselves in this boat. And so we're asking, where should we move? And the answer is, if you want a technical answer from a climate scientist who has had this conversation with her husband already over our own long-term planning, we have to look for places where the risks that they face today are ones that can continue to be manageable in the future, that have an ample supply of fresh water, an ample supply of other resources. And what looks really good is the Midwest and Ontario and that kind of area around the Great Lakes that has a lot of fresh water. It is prone to flooding, so you have to be careful where you live, because Minnesota has seen massive increases in flooding, as has my own home of Southern Ontario. But our resources are becoming particularly pressed in a lot of places like Miami with sea level rise, like Phoenix with extreme heat, like some areas of California with wildfire. People are starting to think, is it even worth this in the future? There's actually lists, the weather.com and other organizations have made lists of the top 25 cities that are likely most at risk from climate change and the top 25 cities that are most likely safer from climate change impacts for the next few decades at least. So if you're interested, Google something about, cities and climate change and you'll see some of these lists pop up.
Yeah, thanks. I know I've seen some stories about some small towns in northern Minnesota saying this is a good place. Please come. Towns that have had a declining population over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. More questions. A question about modeling. I think from somebody in the in the regulatory background, how do we better communicate to the public about all the modeling in attempt to better understand potential impacts of various events? And although not perfect, the modeling documents a better understanding of the various physical and chemical relationships. And they're saying it's not perfect, modeling's not perfect, but how to talk about that in a way that the public might understand that.
Sure. So I am going to drop into the chat, which I just did right now, the link to our Global Weirding episode on climate models. So if you feel like I don't really understand what these things are, we have a 6-minute video that explains what they are, what they do, and what they use them from. So climate models are fascinating. We actually use them to study other planets. We use them to study the distant past here on Earth. We obviously use them to study what's happening today and what we expect to happen in the future. And there's a lot of misunderstanding because when people say models, they think it's just kind of a bunch of correlations like, oh, you say CO2 is going up, therefore temperature is going up. What models are is they're our lab because we climate scientists can't put the Earth in a test tube. We have to have some way of running experiments on our planet to ask what if questions. What if the Earth was entirely covered with ice? What if the Earth had no ice at all? What if humans continue to wrap an extra blanket around the planet, the likes of which we haven't seen for 50 million years? What would happen then? That's what we use our models to study. But we don't need these models at all to know that climate is changing, that humans are responsible, that the impacts are serious, and the time to act is now. We don't need the models to know that. What we do use the models for, and this is actually my own research, is we use the models to look forward into the future and say, what happens if the world gets warmer by 1.5, 2, 3, or 4 degrees? And I take that information and I translate it down to the local scale where people live, so that farmers in Iowa can understand that if it gets warmer by 1.5 degrees Celsius, and of course you have to translate that to Fahrenheit, and then we translate that into crop yields, here's what the corn yields will look like. If it gets warmer by 2 degrees, here's what the corn yields will look like. And if it gets warmer by 3 degrees, here's what the corn yields will look like. And so before you know it, you've got Iowa farmers with a position on the Paris Agreement because finally they actually saw global change translated into something that made sense for them, which is their crop yields using the information and the models and the procedures that they're familiar with. And they could say, okay, 1.5 degrees, we can cope with it. 2 degrees, we'd have to do things differently, but we could still farm corn. 3 degrees, we could not farm corn under that scenario. So that's what we use the models for, and they are very powerful tools for helping everybody from water managers to wildlife ecologists to city planners to farmers understand how to better prepare for the impacts we can't avoid, but also to understand why taking action today is so important, because our systems are not going to be able to function if we get past 2 or 3 or 4 degrees.
Thank you. A few more sort of climate science related questions. So we are seeing one that I think we tie together, one around seeing a lot of thermal stresses in North America, and a question about the global south. What is that looking like right now? And then also a question about tipping points and a concern that we may have passed many of the critical tipping points and that too far along to stave off some of the worst effects, and the climate is sort of on track to do what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm.
That was not actually, those are my words, not actually the author's words.
Right. No. I totally understand. Well, those are two different issues. So let me talk about the first one first. So as I mentioned back at the beginning, when Susan asked me, why are you a climate scientist? I became a climate scientist because climate change is profoundly unfair. It disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. I went to the Paris Climate Conference, and I went, with the idea that we're always talking about how do we cut our carbon emissions, and the conference is about how to cut our emissions. But while I was there, I spoke with so many people from so many countries around the world, and the vast majority of those people were in Paris to simply say, we are suffering. We are suffering the impacts of heat-trapping gas emissions that we didn't create. Our carbon footprint as a country is virtually nil. Yet we are suffering devastating droughts, record-breaking heat waves, increasing invasive species and pests and diseases, rising sea levels, stronger hurricanes and flooding. We are suffering all of these things. And when they happen, we don't have crop insurance. We don't have the National Guard. We don't have home insurance. We don't have several $1,000s in our bank account to tide us over the difficult times and buy food when our crop fails. We don't have any of this. And so people are suffering and people are dying already because of climate change. And they were just there to say, help. So climate change is profoundly unfair. And what we are seeing here and what our news media reports on in North America is literally the tip of the iceberg of what is happening around the world. So I love following organizations, often faith-based organizations like Arasha, global organizations like Tear Fund. Tear Fund is fantastic, by the way. If you're on Instagram, I highly recommend Tear Fund because they connect the dots every single day between poverty, between vulnerability, between injustice, and between climate change. So yes, climate change does matter even more to those countries, and they have a double whammy because they didn't contribute to the problem, yet they are suffering the impacts. So how do we talk about the future? It is not too late to avoid the worst impacts. But the further we go into the future, conducting what is truly an unprecedented experiment with the only home that we have, as far back as we can go in the history of the planet, we have never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this fast, for human reasons or for natural reasons. The more unprecedented the experiment we conduct with our planet, the greater the risk of really, truly unpleasant and nasty surprises. We don't know exactly when they will happen because, again, this situation is unprecedented. But we do know that the more we do, the more likely it is that something bad is going to happen. And so to me, the most concerning chapter of the National Climate Assessment was the one that I wrote right here. I put it in the chat with a colleague of mine called Bob Cobb. And the title of the chapter is Potential Surprises. And these surprises are not the good kind of surprises. They're the bad kind of surprises. We don't know exactly when they're going to happen, but we have a pretty good idea of some of them. Some of them we don't even know about yet. But we know one thing. The faster we cut our carbon, the better off we're going to be and the safer we're going to be.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. I think we'll kind of rein it in there. I know there's a lot more questions that have come in, and I want to encourage everyone again. Catherine has amazing information on her website and in her TED Talks. She's dropped a lot of links in here. So I really encourage you to check out those TED Talks. I can probably answer many more of the questions that have come up in that way. And, to really end on that hopeful note of saying, that we do have agency. There are a lot of things that we can do, from individuals and congregations cutting their carbon emissions within their homes and their places of worship, which may seem very small, but when you multiply that out by lots of actions in lots of places by lots of people, it really does have a big impact. And of course, just encouraging you all to be advocates for climate and energy policy in your local communities, in your states, and of course at the federal level. There are lots of ways to get involved, and IPL has state affiliates all around the country working on climate change and climate policy. So please get involved at the local level. And also, again, we want to encourage you to get out there and vote in 2020 and vote with climate and creation in mind, because getting climate champions who really care about this issue is going to take a long way towards those global solutions that need to happen. I want to thank Catherine for being my guest today, sharing her important perspective on how to communicate with friends and family on climate change centered in our shared values. I think we can't stress that enough. So Catherine, thank you for your wisdom on that. And I want to encourage you before you go to drop a note of thanks to Catherine in our chat, and we will be sharing those with her after the webinar ends. I'm sure she'd love to see your words of thanks that I know are being shared into the chat right now. Thank you for attending today and being a part of this important conversations. If you have other questions for Interfaith Power and Light, please send them to our info@interfaithpowerandlight.org email address. And again, we'll share the recording and the links from today's webinar via email with you tomorrow. Any last words of wisdom for us, Catherine?
Well, I'm just so touched by all the really wonderful things people are saying. Thank you so much. Thank you for the encouragement. Thank you for the support. Thank you for the prayers. And this is recorded. You can share it with other people. We've shared lots of links in the chat. And I'm super excited that there's a new book coming out called Climate Courage. And I wrote the foreword for it. And Andreas, the author, and I and Bill McKibben are doing a chat on that next week. There's a link there in the chat too. And there's another amazing book called All We Can Save that contains women voices from across the entire spectrum, everything from essays to poetry. All We Can Save is coming out soon too. I would really encourage people to check out Climate Courage, All We Can Save, and going back to the very first question, another third new book called Angry Weather, that talks about how we know climate change is affecting extreme events. It's a fascinating book, super easy to read. I highly recommend all three of those if you want more. And thank you so much again for joining us today. This has been a great source of encouragement to me personally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being with us today, and blessings on the journey. Thank you for all you do.